Busta Rhymes!
You look freshly done too, King. Thank you. Busta Rhymes, welcome to the WayMakers Summit and the Hope Luncheon.
Thank you, Godfather Waymaker. You look at all of this amazingness that you have made a way for, sir.
Well, thank you. So, Busta, our theme this year is somebody has to be great. Why not you?
Well, first and foremost, by the grace of the Most High, and from your mouth to God's ears. But as far as I'm concerned, and what my circumstances were, fortunately, I don't have that story of being a child from the projects that didn't have nothing and was suffering. You know, my parents did an amazing job. My parents worked hard, and I had 19-inch color TVs with ColecoVision and Atari when I was 9 and 10 years old. But I had a beautiful Jamaican, hard-working family household and upbringing. But the thing that made me realize that I had no choice but to be great was because I didn't like the fact that my parents, as much as they bust their ass to make sure that I didn't need, and my brother didn't need, and I only have one sibling, I didn't like how much they had to, like, it just looked like they were slave laboring to do that. And I didn't like what that looked like. I didn't like that my mom's was coming home, her ankles were swollen every day, working for these white institutions. My father used to work for this department store at the time. It was called Mays. And like they had these department stores like Abraham and Strauss around at that time. And my father used to work as a licensed electrical contractor for these institutions, and it didn't matter how great he was at his job, it was never enough. So I think the first example of greatness that I identified was within the house, because my father ultimately made a decision to no longer subject himself to that. And he was the first one that I saw that had one job with Mays, got tired of dealing with the shit that he was subjected to working at Mays, and then he quit. And then he started his own company as a licensed electrical contractor called TGS Electric. And those was the initials of his name, Trevor George Smith Electric. And I don't know if y'all are familiar, but traditionally Caribbean people, they base stability on being people that learns a skill set and they learn a trade. You know, be an electrician, be a plumber, you know, be a carpenter. So my father was on that, and he was a real man's man. Like, he really wasn't into any feminine tendencies in the house. That's just the way he was raised as a man. You know, the women would master that, and then the man had to master being a man. And the way my father led by example, I identified with his determination and his passion to be great. And I definitely didn't want to be the weak link in my house. So becoming great was no longer an option or a negotiable stipulation for me.
So Busta, why did you choose the music route to be great? You know, we know you probably could have done a lot of different things, because
Right.
you're a smart guy, you're very talented. Why was music that thing that you said, that's what you want to focus on?
Well, the music thing, for me, hip hop overall for me, when I was first introduced to it, it was just like I saw myself in it. Even though I didn't know how to participate in any of it because I wasn't rhyming at the time, I wasn't breakdancing, I wasn't DJing, and I wasn't doing graffiti. But I loved it so much. Just as a fan, there was nothing more important to me than doing what I loved as a child. You know, whatever you did as a child, you wanted to play around because you loved playing around. You know, you pursued your first girlfriend because you liked her a lot. You know, I liked hip hop so much that I instantaneously grew in love with it. But the thing that drove me to making the choice was that my father, he was so strong-willed about making sure that he didn't play with the life of his children, that he didn't entertain what I liked or what I loved. And it kind of created a friction between me and him because I felt like he wasn't being as willing to support my dream or my passion or what I loved. He wasn't even willing to entertain what I was entertaining as an idea outside of what he felt worked for him, which was becoming an apprentice electrician like him. So I believe it was a situation that transpired for me where, again, I didn't need nothing. My parents took amazing care of me. But I was born and raised in East Flatbush, Brooklyn. And in East Flatbush, Brooklyn at the time, in the mid-'80s, I would say around '83, I was 12. And a lot of my superheroes at the time was drug dealers. And in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, you know, they look like superheroes for real. Big chains, the Benzes, the 190Es, the Cressidas, the Maximas, you know, all of them cars. And another thing that was extremely present in my neighborhood was the 5% nation of the gods and earths, the Zulu nation. And what I loved about this time frame was because it was super cool to be smart. You know what I'm saying? It was cool to know how much the earth weighed as one of the gods in the neighborhood, and having names like Supreme Justice and Divine Magnetic and Lord Victorious, like superhero names. So my family raised me Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And they had me in a Christian school. And I would be in the Christian school and I would look in the Bible and I would look in the different things they was teaching us in school. And the contrast of having that information, having my father that wasn't really super supportive of me with this music thing, with this hip hop thing, having these brothers in the neighborhood that I would see every time that I was either going to school or coming home from school, it was a conflicting time for me because I'm in school being taught through a faith that did not have any image of anything outside of white faces. There wasn't no Puerto Ricans in the Bible. There wasn't no black man in the Bible. There wasn't no Asians in the Bible. And at that young age, I found that to be a problem. So in the mornings on the way to school, you know, and dealing with my father and his whole, I don't want to hear about that rap shit, I would also be getting my mom's super nurturing support because she was into anything that would keep me away from the mischief that I could find in the street. And the music was preoccupying my time in that way, but even more importantly, as I'm sitting in the crib watching Transformers in the morning, the cartoon, or Voltron in the morning, the cartoon, and I'm looking at the Transformers and there's names like Megatron and Optimus Prime and Soundwave, and they coming from these planets to Earth, and then I get out the crib and go to the corner store, and there was a store owned by a Puerto Rican family, and everybody in the store, we would call them Pancho, whether they was male or female. You go in there, you get your Charleston Chews, which was the cool candy at the time, and your Bubble Yum, and Snickers bar, and your Lemon Heads, and all of that. And you get your snacks to go to school with. And these brothers from the 5% Nation of the Gods and Earths would be on the corner outside, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And they was build on these lessons, and it was talking about what the total square mileage of the planet was, and how far each planet was from the sun, and how much the earth weighed, how much useful land is used every day by the original man, how much useful land is used every day by Caucasian man. And I wasn't never hearing this information in school. So they had names like Supreme Justice and all of that, and those names seemed like the names from the Transformers. So I thought they were superheroes to me. So I would go in school wanting to be like the superheroes with all of this information that school wasn't giving me. And then I would want to always experience that I told you so moment in school, because then I started asking questions in school that I knew that the teachers didn't have the answers to. And in those moments, it made me feel empowered. Last but not least, I think the most important thing was that combined with my father making me go to work with him, not really giving me a choice. And while we would be in these buildings in Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene that would be abandoned buildings that he would get the contracts to wire the entire building, rats and roaches in the basement, it's damp and it's wet, and you would see kids outside playing little games like Skelly and Coco Livio, stickball, two-hand touch football. I wasn't able to participate in that, but I was learning this skill on how to put receptacles for lights and ceilings and pull BX cables through the walls with the sheetrock, and learn the skill set at 11 and 12 years old. But I was getting callous hands from young, and I didn't feel like I was enjoying my childhood as a youth. So that actually made me pursue rhyming so much more, because I wanted to be able to develop this skill set that would provide me with an alternative to not have to go to work with my father.
So when you think back on that relationship with your father, Busta, at this moment of time, not then.
Yeah, at that time, I definitely hated the shit out of that.
So,
but in hindsight, you know, and God bless my dad because he passed away in 2014, but we became like the best of friends, because when I started to have children and I started to get dragged through these court systems, I had amazing mothers for my children, but I didn't have the best relationship with the mothers because I was still young, and I was still trying to make home wherever I laid my hat. So being young and being a successful and thinking that you on your Rico Suave shit, you know, I wasn't making the best judgment calls at the time in these young relationships having children, but I had to ask my father for a lot of guidance while I was going through that. And I realized in the process, it wasn't that he wasn't supportive of what I wanted to do. He just wasn't willing to gamble with the life of his son that he loved so much. And I appreciated it so much later on.
So what would you say to these young men out here who may be having that same sort of, we would say, challenge or disagreement with their dad? What advice would you give them today, having been through that and now are able to look back on it? What advice would you give to young men who may be dealing with that today?
The first thing that I'm gonna give you young gentlemen is some piece of advice in reference to that relationship dynamic between you and your father that might be in a space where he's not willing to entertain your experimental phase in life. I do think that it's extremely important to understand why dad is like that, instead of thinking that he's just a dickhead. Because dad been through some shit that you can't speak to. Dad been through some shit that you can't even identify with. And a lot of the times we be feeling like as youngins, yeah, Dad, what you went through is some shit from your day. I'm an isolated incident. So I might know how to avoid stepping in the shit piles that you stepped in because I'm living in a different time. The problem is there ain't nothing new that hasn't already happened under the sun. So when you make excuses to justify the bullshit that you want to do because you don't want to listen, you actually deserve the ass beating or the penalty that you're going to suffer and receive 10 times fold. Because the thing that you really got to understand is that justice is the reward or penalty for one's actions or deed. You get rewarded for the shit that you do that's right. You're going to get penalized for the shit that you do that's wrong. Because with every choice comes an invoice. So, you know, it's really important to build with your father because there's a reason that he's being, as you would want to say, stubborn or not supportive or old-fashioned. But there's a lot of the things that unfortunately community lacks now that your father was truly blessed with being able to benefit from, that's missing in a significant way today. And if you just give the old king an opportunity to just download that jewelry in your treasure chest, you'll be surprised how much you'll be coming back to Dad later on when you around your crew that don't got that jewelry, and you start sounding like your father when you talking to your homies. And then you come back and chill with your pops one day and be like, yo, Pops, it be bugging me out sometimes because I be saying shit to my homies that you've been saying to me that be making me realize that I sound like you. And I'm experiencing that firsthand right now with my own kids. They come back and tell me, Dad, a lot of the times the things you used to say that we wasn't really willing to hear, and I be having conversations with my folks and I be talking to them sounding like you, Pop. So I get it now. I see shit from a perspective that I could really appreciate, and I'm super grateful to you for it, Dad. And it's a beautiful feeling to have as a father, and I think it's even more of a beautiful feeling as sons when you know that you've been able to have a father that can download y'all with that precious shit.
So Busta, this conversation is turned in a different direction, more about life than we talk about music, which is good. Me and Wallow was with Kenny Burns in the podcast room, and he talked about how do you communicate with young people now. And you know, one of the things that Wallow said is that you listen first. You being in hip hop, having a lot of attraction to young people, and being a dad at the same time, what advice would you give the men who are in this room on how to relate and communicate with their young sons or daughters, for the matter of fact? Somebody who's very, very popular with that audience. Talk to us about that.
All right, so I'm one of them super competitive MCs. I come from the era when there was no social media platforms to get your buzz, so you had to be in a position where you stayed ready so you wouldn't have to get ready. Whenever you stepped out your crib, if an MC wanted smoke, you had to be willing to run towards wherever the fire was, and you run towards what most was running from. With that being said, when you get to that age where you start having these kids and you're an actively successful artist, while you have these kids that are old enough to have their own artists that they're fans of. And I'm giving you a literal example. So I got 6 beautiful kids, right? And at the time, I had just gotten custody of 3 of my 6 children. So now I'm starting to enjoy having the cookouts at the crib and shit, and then having their friends come by, and I'm flipping the burger and flipping the hot dogs. We wasn't calling that shit glizzy, so y'all don't even talk about paws to me. Hot dogs and burgers. So I'm in the backyard of the crib, and I'm flipping the burgers, and we playing the music, and they got their friends, and they sitting and waiting for the food. And while I'm sitting there cooking on the grill, they having a debate about who their favorite MC is. And I'm not coming up in this conversation, and I'm sitting here making their food, and I'm looking at these little motherfuckers like, "But y'all don't see me here?" You know what I'm saying? But I can't say nothing because I'm not gonna look like I'm thirsty for attention. So I'm just listening to this shit. And they saying a bunch of their MC's names. Some of them I never heard of, some of them I was familiar with, some of them I was just getting introduced to, maybe prior to that moment. But the beautiful thing about that moment, while I was thinking about poisoning their food because they wasn't talking about me, and that's just my competitive nature getting in the way, I was taking notes in my phone, and I'm listening to them. And again, the key thing of what our beloved just said is that listening to the young generation before you talk is super important. And I understood that, fortunately, because a lot of the times just listening, they gonna tell on themselves anyway. So I would take these names and I would go to the studio, and this was like a lot of the mixtape eras was happening still. And I would just do unofficial remixes on all of their favorite MC's records. Sometimes I would send these verses with me on these artists' records to their managers, or I would have my managers do it, get them the opportunity to make it official so that these record companies would support these remix versions with the Busta Rhymes verse, because they know that it's gonna upgrade the record, because I ain't playing when I'm on these remixes. The gift and the curse in those situations was I would go so hard on these records that a lot of the times some of the managers would be like, "Nah, we can't use your verse. You're stealing all of the shine from the artist." Then in other instances, it would be appreciated that I would just solicit myself. They didn't have to ask. They didn't have to think about me. They ended up getting gifted with these Busta Rhymes verses, and then we'll work out the business later, and these records would come out, and I just continue to saturate the market, promote myself. But the rewarding thing for me was being able to have the next cookout 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later. These records done circulated. Whatever wasn't officially used by the artists with their management, we would just leak on mixtapes. We'll get to that. But what I'm saying is that these same cookouts that we would have weeks later, my kids would have, their conversations would change. Now they sitting at the barbecue again, or the cookout rather, and they like, "Yo, you hear how your pops killed such and such on this record? Yo, your pops bodied such and such. Yo, pops ill, son. Yo, pops crazy." So now I'm looking at them different, and my Diddy Bop different as I'm bringing them their food. But again, it all boils down to listening. So believe it or not, my kids kept me in tune with making sure that I never sounded like the old-timer MC that was dated and I wasn't keeping my finger on the pulse. So I was super grateful to my kids for that, and I'm super grateful to a lot of what the younger artists is doing, because I don't think a lot of the elder statesmen realize sometimes when you complain about what the new artist is doing, you ain't really helping the situation by complaining. You should put your arm around these dudes, build a relationship, and download them with the information and your experience so that they could take that. They could take that and mix it with what they do and make it theirs and create something even greater than what they was doing without your conversation, even if they was doing well. And they could also reintroduce you to another generation and help you buy another 10 years of life to add to your legacy. So it's one hand wash the other and both hands wash the face. We need each other.
So Busta, we done passed our time, but I got to get this question in.
Gotcha.
Is we believe that every successful person on the planet has had a waymaker. Who has been Busta Rhymes' waymaker?
Wow. Okay. I've had several waymakers. Like I mentioned a little earlier, I had waymakers that was drug dealers. At the time when I was 12 and 13 years old, 14 years old, my mother and father had a divorce. My mother moved to Florida. My father stayed in Brooklyn. My father wasn't as supportive of what I was doing with the music. I decided to leave home. I didn't want to go to Florida. I didn't want to leave the neighborhood I was raised in. I ended up living with a good friend of mine, and his mother had 3 children in a 2-bedroom home. So I was the 4th one when they welcomed me in. But she said I had to spend $75 a week to stay there. That's $300 a month at 14 years old. Too young to get working papers, so I couldn't get a legit job. So in order to live there, I had to do shit in the street. The beautiful thing about these brothers is that they really wasn't pro me hustling. But they's like, if you're gonna do it, you're gonna do it around this guidance. So we could minimize the shit piles you're gonna step in. When they realized that I was an MC, they actually encouraged me to get out of the shit that I was doing with them. And they would give me money to go to the studio. So those brothers was like waymans for me. My mother was my first wayman. She signed my contract when I was 17. If I misbehaved on that day, and she woke up on the wrong side of the bed, y'all probably would have never heard of Busta Rhymes, because she wouldn't have signed the contract. Chuck D gave me my name. He taught me the importance of clamp. And he always said that clamp was concept, lyrics, attitude/appearance, music, performance. And if you got all of that down and mastered, you got a clamp on the game. He took us on the road, let us open up for him as leaders of the new school before we got the deal. We learned so many fundamentals from that man. It's the reason why all of my albums kind of sounded like Fear of a Black Planet. It take a nation of millions to hold us back, because my albums became The Coming and When Disaster Strikes, an extinction level event. I was trying to be like my big bros. So Busta Rhymes, I ain't like that name neither. My name was Chillo Ski before that. And the reason why that trash name was cool to me at the time was because all of my favorite MCs had 3-part names. LL Cool J, Doug E. Fresh, Kool Moe Dee, Grand Master Caz. So I thought Chill O Ski was cool. And Chuck D said, nah, that ain't it. And he introduced me to this football card collection that he had, because he was very much into sports, and he showed me this football player who played for the Minnesota Vikings in 1985 named Busta Rhymes. And he said, you always reminded me of this football player because you perform with so much aggression. It's like you playing football when you spit. You should just try the name Busta Rhymes for a little while, and if you don't like it, you could go back to being Chillo Ski. But the point that I'm trying to make is everybody that I listened to that made way for me to make the magic happen, it pretty much worked for the most part. So I want to thank all of those incredible waymakers that helped create and give birth to Busta Rhymes.
Busta, thank you.
Make some noise
Thank you,
for Busta Rhymes. More noise, y'all. Make some noise. Busta Rhymes, y'all. We got a super incredible panel coming up.